Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, glad to share this quiet hour with you. Tell me, is there a lamp lit nearby? Perhaps a cup of something warm within reach? These are the small details Watson trusted most. Tonight we follow him into a matter of ink, altered records, and a truth buried beneath 30 years of silence. Do subscribe, so no chapter escapes you. Now, settle in. For as Holmes knew, the most important clues are often the ones nobody thought to hide. Find us on Spotify. The link is just below. Chapter 1. The Solicitor of Gray's Inn. It is a peculiarity of my long association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes that the cases which proved most remarkable to me were seldom those which announced themselves with any great fanfare. The thunderclap of a Moriarty, the public drama of a royal scandal. These are the affairs which lend themselves to advertisement. Yet it has been my experience, recorded faithfully across many years of companionship with the most singular mind I have ever encountered, that the deepest mysteries arrive quietly, carried by nervous hands and accompanied by the faint scent of anxiety. So it was on a bleak Thursday afternoon in November, one of those afternoons when London seems to have drawn a grey curtain across the whole of the world, that the case I have elected to call the matter of the Tampered court record first intruded upon our comfortable rooms at 221 B. Baker Street. I had returned from my rounds shortly before 3 o'clock to find Holmes in his customary attitude of concentrated idleness, stretched lengthwise upon the settee, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes fixed upon a point somewhere above the mantelpiece that appeared to contain, for him at least, a wealth of invisible information. The chemical apparatus on the side table had recently been employed. The faint, astringent residue of some compound hung in the air, and a scatter of newspapers lay about the floor with the casual devastation that invariably accompanied his moods of restless cogitation. "You've had a trying afternoon, Watson," said he without turning his head. "Mrs. Abernethy's influenza, I should think, followed by at least 2 house calls in the vicinity of Marylebone. You have walked the better part of 3 miles in this weather." "The mud on my boots has told you so, I suppose," said I, sinking into my armchair with the gratitude of a man who has earned his fireside. "The mud confirms the distance. The slight redness about your left wrist suggests you carried your bag on that side for longer than usual, a compensation for the cramp you have been developing since Tuesday. The Abernethy connection is simple enough. You mentioned her appointment yesterday evening, and the ligustrum berries on your coat lapel match precisely the variety that grows beside her garden gate in Blandford Street." He uncoiled himself from the settee with that sudden cat-like energy that always rather startled me. "In any case, we shall have company presently. Mrs. Hudson has aired the second armchair, which she does only when she anticipates a visitor of some consequence." I had scarce time to pour myself a cup of the cold tea remaining in the pot before the bell sounded below, and within a minute Mrs. Hudson ushered into our rooms a gentleman whose appearance repaid careful study. He was a man of perhaps 60 years, dressed with the quiet precision that speaks not of vanity, but of professional habit. His frock coat was of fine black wool, his cravat immaculately pinned, and his silver hair brushed back with mathematical neatness. Yet these marks of order were contradicted by the condition of his gloves, which had been twisted and worked between his fingers until they were close to ruined, and by the 2 deep lines about his mouth that suggested a prolonged interior distress rather than the ordinary worries of a man of affairs. But he carried a leather document case, which he held rather than merely carried, clutched to his side with the protective instinct of one bearing something irreplaceable, or perhaps incriminating. "Mr. Holmes," said he, his voice measured and deliberate in the manner of a man accustomed to choosing words for their legal precision, "I am Alistair Penbury. I am a solicitor of some 30 years' standing, a member of Gray's Inn, and I confess that I come to you this afternoon in a condition I have not experienced since I was a young man reading for the bar. I am, Mr. Holmes, genuinely frightened." Holmes gestured toward the armchair and settled himself opposite, his grey eyes intent and unreadable. "Then pray sit down, Mr. Penbury, and let us begin at the beginning. which I find invariably the most instructive place. Penbury settled his document case upon his knees, drew a long breath, and composed himself with the visible effort of a disciplined intelligence wrestling against an equally disciplined anxiety. I drew out my notebook from force of long habit, and Holmes caught my eye with a faint nod that indicated I should do so. The story that Penbury laid before us was, on its surface, a modest enough affair. Some 30 years past in the early years of his practice, he had served as junior prosecuting counsel in a case before the High Court involving one Edwin Mallory, a clerk employed by a firm of city merchants. Mallory had been accused of systematic fraud, the falsification of ledger entries over a period of 18 months, in diverting small but cumulative sums into accounts beyond his employer's knowledge. The evidence had been compelling, the conviction secured, and Mallory had served his sentence. He had, according to all available intelligence, died some years afterward in reduced circumstances, broken in health and reputation. It was not a celebrated case, Penbury said, with the careful understatement of a man who has rehearsed his narrative. It received a column or two in the press and was forgotten within a fortnight. Mallory himself was a quiet, unremarkable individual. There was nothing in the matter to distinguish it from a dozen similar prosecutions of that era. "And yet," said Holmes, very quietly, "you are here." Penbury opened his document case and produced a sheaf of papers. Official documents, unmistakably, bearing the seals and flourishes of the High Court archive. 3 weeks ago I had occasion to consult the records of that case on behalf of a client in a tangentially related commercial matter. What I found disturbed me considerably. He laid the papers upon Holmes's outstretched hand. The record has been altered. Holmes examined the documents in silence for several minutes. I observed that he tilted them twice toward the lamplight, ran his finger along the edge of the paper without touching the surface, and at one point withdrew his lens from his coat pocket to examine a section of text with close attention. "The alterations are subtle," Holmes said at last. "A date here, moved forward by some 2 weeks. A passage of testimony quietly softened in its implications. The substitution of one adjective for another in the summary of evidence." He set the papers down with the deliberation of a man placing an unexploded device upon a table. They would pass unnoticed by any reader who had not intimate knowledge of the original proceedings. "How did you detect them, Mr. Penbury?" "Because I was there," the solicitor replied simply. "I cross-examined the principal witnesses myself. I know what was said." Holmes pressed his fingertips together and regarded our visitor with an expression of sharp, dispassionate interest. "You describe these changes as minor, a date, a softened phrase, and yet you are, as you say, genuinely frightened. That is disproportionate, Mr. Penbury, unless the significance of the alterations is considerably greater than their surface appearance suggests." A long silence followed. The fire crackled. Outside, the November wind pressed against the windows with a dull, persistent insistence. "Someone has gone to great trouble," Holmes continued, his voice dropping to a tone of precise, unhurried deliberation, "to revise a document that the world at large had forgotten entirely. They have done so with skill and care, suggesting both technical knowledge and access to sealed records. They have not erased the case. They have not destroyed it. They have adjusted it, as one might adjust the balance of a scale by the removal of a single, carefully chosen grain." He fixed Penbury with a gaze of extraordinary intensity. "The question that presents itself is not merely who has done this. The question is what, in that old case, those small adjustments are designed to obscure or to reveal." Penbury's hands tightened once more upon the edge of his document case. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I prosecuted Edwin Mallory to the best of my ability, and upon the evidence before me. I have spent 30 years in the belief that justice was done." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had acquired a quality I can only describe as haunted. "I am no longer certain of that belief." Holmes rose from his chair, moved to the window, and stood for a moment looking down into the grey and streaming Baker Street below. When he turned back, his expression had settled into that particular quality of focused, predatory alertness that I had come to recognise as the sign that a case had truly engaged his remarkable faculties. "Leave the documents with me, Mr. Penbury," said he, "and tell me who else beside yourself was centrally connected to the original prosecution." As Penbury began to answer, I turned to a fresh page in my notebook and wrote at the top, in the shorthand of long practice, the name of Edwin Mallory. It was a name I would write many more times before the affair was concluded. Chapter 2. A Circle of the Unwilling. There are occasions when Sherlock Holmes pursues a case with the restless, consuming energy of a man possessed, when he will go without sleep for 30 hours, pace the length of Baker Street in the small watches of the night, or descend into those districts of London where a gentleman ventures only with purpose and a good deal of caution. There are other occasions, rarer and in their way more instructive, when he is content to wait. These latter moods, and I have come to understand, are not idleness. They are the patience of a man who knows that the quarry will in its own time come to him. In the 2 days that followed Penbury's visit, Holmes examined the altered documents with meticulous care, made one brief excursion to the records rooms of the High Court on the morning after our interview, and received 2 telegrams to which he made no allusion whatsoever. I did not press him. The habit of patient observation, acquired across many years of association, had taught me that Holmes would speak when speaking served a purpose, and that questions put before he was ready to answer them served no purpose at all. It was on the Friday evening, therefore, that I accompanied him to the Penbury townhouse in a quiet street off Gloucester Square, a handsome, reserved sort of dwelling, yet with polished railings and well-tended window-boxes that spoke of comfortable prosperity maintained with some care. Penbury had, at Holmes's suggestion, convened a small dinner-gathering of those individuals who had touched, however lightly, upon the Mallory case of 30 years before. Holmes had been discreet in his reasoning to Penbury. A social occasion would permit observation of several persons at once, without the defensiveness that a formal interview invariably provokes. The other guests were already assembled in the drawing-room when we arrived, and I employed the moments of introduction and the first awkward pleasantries of an evening among near strangers to form my impressions. Miss Eleanor Vance was a woman of perhaps 55, spare and self-contained, with a composed manner and grey, watchful eyes of one who has spent the better part of her life in the employ of others. She was dressed neatly but without ostentation, and held herself with a stillness that I found, on reflection, less the stillness of tranquillity than of habitual vigilance. She had been, Penbury had told us, a governess in the household of a family acquainted with the principal parties at the time of the trial, and had appeared as a character witness in Mallory's defence, a circumstance which seemed 30 years on to sit upon her with a weight she did not entirely conceal. Colonel James Armitage was a broad, florid man of 60-odd years, whose military bearing had softened somewhat into the comfortable solidity of a gentleman farmer. He had, by his own cheerful account, years been entirely peripheral to the original affair, a matter of financial oversight, he said, nothing more, and he spoke of it in the hearty, dismissive manner of a man who wishes to establish, as early in the evening as possible, that a subject holds no particular interest for him. In my experience, such demonstrations are rarely unprompted. Mr. Rupert Dalloway was the most immediately engaging of the three. He was a large, well-fed, energetic man in his early 60s, with a barrister's easy command of any room he entered, a ready laugh, and the particular facility, common to those of his profession, of appearing entirely candid while saying nothing of substance. He had greeted Holmes with the slightly overwarm cordiality of a man who had made inquiries about his fellow guests, and wished to establish, through the manner of a handshake, that he was not alarmed by what he discovered. Mrs. Lydia Penbury was our host's wife, a handsome woman in her middle 50s, still possessed of a beauty that had clearly been considerable in her youth, with dark eyes of unusual steadiness and a quality of composed attention that distinguished her from the general social animation around her. She managed the evening's arrangements with quiet efficiency, and spoke little, but when she did speak it was always to the purpose, and I noticed that she had a habit of listening to the conversation of others with a completeness of attention that most people reserve for matters of personal urgency. The dinner itself was well prepared, and the conversation, as such occasions go, was perfectly civil. It turned upon the usual subjects: the autumn weather, a recent debate in the Commons, the relative merits of two current theatrical productions, and I noted that Holmes, seated between Miss Vance and Armitage, appeared to give himself entirely over to the role of agreeable guest. He spoke of music, of the chemistry of certain dyes, of a walking tour he had apparently undertaken in the Swiss valleys, none of which, I need hardly say, was the actual business of the evening. It was over the dessert that Penbury, with the careful awkwardness of a man who has rehearsed an action and finds the moment of performance unexpectedly difficult, introduced a passing reference to the Mallory case. He framed it as a matter of professional reminiscence, an old prosecution recalled in connection with a current query, and spoke of it in 3 or 4 sentences, naming Mallory directly. The effect upon the table was immediate, and would have rewarded any careful observer. Miss Vance set down her spoon with a precision too deliberate to be natural, and addressed herself to the tablecloth for a moment, before looking up with a smile of perfect pleasantness. Armitage reached for his wine-glass and held it without drinking. Dalloway produced a short, genial laugh, and remarked that old cases had a habit of surfacing at inconvenient moments, a statement so carefully general as to be entirely without content. Mrs. Penbury alone remained still, her dark eyes moving once very briefly toward her husband before returning to the middle distance with an expression I could not read. The conversation recovered itself within moments and moved on, as such conversations do. But the temperature of the room had changed perceptibly, in the manner of a summer afternoon when a cloud passes across the sun without warning. I observed, as the evening continued, 3 further particulars that seemed to me worthy of record. When Armitage spoke of the financial aspects of the case, briefly and in terms of general principle, Miss Vance's posture altered almost imperceptibly, a slight forward incline as though against an instinct. When Dalloway, with great fluency, described the general unreliability of circumstantial evidence in fraud proceedings, Penbury's wife looked at him directly for rather longer than the remark seemed to warrant, and when the party rose from table, Miss Vance contrived to place herself at the far end of the drawing-room from Colonel Armitage, though the movement was accomplished with the practised naturalness of long habit. In the cab home through the damp, lamplit streets, I shared these observations with Holmes. "You have done well, Watson," said he, with the brief sincere approval he offered on those occasions, when he meant it without qualification. Miss Vance's relation to Armitage is one of former dependence and present discomfort. Dalloway's fluency this evening was the fluency of a man who has rehearsed his ground. Note that he did not once look at Penbury during the financial discussion, though Penbury spoke directly to him twice. "And Mrs. Penbury?" I asked. Holmes was silent for a moment, the gas lamps of Edgware Road passing their light across his sharp profile in brief, rhythmic intervals. "Mrs. Penbury," said he at last, "is the most interesting person in that house by a very considerable margin. She's not afraid. She's watchful. The distinction, Watson, matters enormously." He turned his gaze to the passing street. "They are not, any of them, strangers to this matter. They are acquainted with it in the way that people are acquainted with a secret, not as something half-remembered, but as something actively carried." "Then you believe they are concealing something collectively?" "I believe," Holmes replied, "that they are each concealing the same thing independently, which is a rather different and rather more dangerous situation." He settled back into the corner of the cab, his chin lowered to his chest. "We shall call upon Penbury in the morning. I have a number of questions that the evening has made necessary." But when morning came, it was not we who called upon Penbury. It was Inspector Lestrade who arrived at Baker Street before 9 o'clock, he with news that rendered all our planned questions academic, and introduced into the affair a gravity that no dinner-table observation could have anticipated. Alistair Penbury had been found dead in his private chambers. Chapter 3. The Death in Chambers. Inspector Lestrade has never, in all the years of our acquaintance, been a man given to understatement. He arrives at conclusions with the confidence of one who mistakes momentum for accuracy, and he delivers his news with the particular energy of a terrier that has found something in the undergrowth and is not yet entirely certain what it is. Yet, on that grey Saturday morning, when Mrs. Hudson showed him into our rooms with his coat still damp from the street, I saw in his sharp, ferret-like face an expression less of professional urgency than of genuine unease. "Mr. Holmes," said he, without preliminary, "Alistair Penbury is dead. Found an hour ago by his housemaid in the small study adjoining his library. The police surgeon has been, and the preliminary judgment is poisoning, laudanum most probably, administered in his evening brandy." Holmes, who had been standing at the window with his pipe, turned with the calm deliberation of a man who's been told something he had already considered as a possibility. "No signs of entry by force, I take it?" "None. Every window secured from within, front door on the latch as normal. Either he admitted whoever did this himself, or—" Lestrade paused, uncomfortable with the alternative. "Or he administered the dose himself," Holmes completed. "A conclusion you find unsatisfying, I observe. Or you would not be here." "The amount was excessive for a man seeking sleep," Lestrade said. "And there is the matter of the documents." Holmes set down his pipe. "Tell me." "The Tampered court record you may already know about. Penbury had retrieved it from the archive 3 days ago and was keeping it at the house. It is gone. In its place, on the desk beside the brandy decanter, is another document. Similar in appearance, identical in format, but with several passages altered from the version Penbury had been studying. I had risen from my chair during this exchange and reached for my coat without any particular conscious decision. Within 20 minutes, the three of us were climbing the steps of the Penbury townhouse in Gloucester Square, where a constable stood at the door with the impassive solemnity of his office, and the upstairs curtains had already been drawn against the pale November morning. The study was a compact book-lined room at the rear of the first floor, its single window overlooking the small-walled garden behind the house. It was a room that spoke of regular occupation, the desk well worn, the books on the lower shelves showing the creased spines of volumes frequently consulted, a tobacco jar and an empty glass resting on a silver tray at the desk's right corner. Beside the tray stood a decanter of brandy, a third of its contents remaining. The police surgeon, a compact brisk man named Holloway, had not yet departed. "Laudanum, as I told the inspector," he said when Holmes questioned him. "Quite a substantial measure dissolved into the brandy. A man drinking a single glass in the ordinary course of his evening would receive more than sufficient to suppress respiration during sleep. There would have been no pain and no evident struggle. He would simply not have awakened." Holmes thanked him with a courtesy that dismissed him simultaneously, and turned to the room with that absolute, consuming attention that always made the presence of anyone else feel faintly beside the point. "I have accompanied Holmes to a considerable number of scenes of death, and I have long ceased to be disturbed by his manner at them. Where others see tragedy, he sees information. It is not callousness. I have observed enough of his private responses to be certain of that, but rather the discipline of a mind that understands the dead are best served by clear thinking." He moved slowly around the perimeter of the room, his lens in hand, pausing at intervals to examine surfaces, angles, and the quality of the light as it fell across various objects. At the fireplace he stopped for some moments. I watched him lower himself to one knee and bring his lens very close to the hearthstone, then to the inner wall of the grate, where the morning's fire had been newly laid but not yet lit. When he rose, his expression had acquired a particular quality of suppressed satisfaction. "Watson, come and tell me what you smell here." I crouched beside the fireplace and inhaled carefully. Beneath the familiar cold ash smell of a disused grate and the faint damp of the chimney, there was something else, a sharp, faintly acrid quality, thin but unmistakable to a medical nose. "Chemical," I said. Something acidic. It reminds me of the preparation used for treating certain papers against damp, a fixative compound of some kind. Precisely so. Holmes rose and moved to the desk, where the replacement document lay in a brown paper envelope. He did not touch it, but bent over it with his lens, examining the envelope's surface and then the visible edge of the paper within. There, the ink along the margin of the third paragraph. Do you see the slight variation in lustre? The original ink has been treated, Watson, not erased in the ordinary sense. That would leave a detectable roughness in the paper. This is a chemical process, considerably more sophisticated. Lestrade, who had been following Holmes's circuit with the slightly impatient attention of a man watching a clockmaker disassemble a watch. He is fairly sure he could repair himself. Darcy cleared his throat. The document, then, replaced by someone with access to the house and knowledge of chemistry. Among other things. Holmes straightened and moved toward the grate a final time, where he retrieved from beneath the fire-iron rest a small scrap of paper, charred at one edge and no larger than a man's palm. He held it to the light. I could make out, on the unburned portion, part of an embossed legal seal and 3 lines of text, the last of which terminated in mid-sentence. Holmes studied it for perhaps 20 seconds, then placed it carefully in his notebook between 2 blank pages. The seal is from the original document, or something closely related to it. This scrap was not entirely consumed, an oversight by whoever lit that fire and then, evidently, thought better of waiting for it to complete its work. Then he was interrupted, Lestrade suggested. Or she was cautious, Holmes replied, without emphasis. The observation hung in the room without further comment. We spent another quarter-hour in the study before Holmes declared himself satisfied, and it was as we prepared to descend that Mrs. Penbury appeared at the doorway. She was dressed in black, her dark eyes composed and clear, her hands quite still at her sides. Grief, where it was present, had arranged itself in her with the quiet order of a woman who has long practice in the government of her emotions. "Mr. Holmes," said she, "I understand you were acquainted with my husband's concerns before his death. I should like to speak with you, if you are willing." "I am most willing, Mrs. Penbury," Holmes replied, "though I must ask you one question before we proceed to conversation." He regarded her steadily. "Your husband retrieved the court record from the archive 3 days ago. Were you aware that he had done so?" Something moved behind her eyes. Not alarm, but a swift, precise calculation, the visible working of a mind deciding in a fraction of a second exactly how much the truth was worth. "I was," she said. "And did you read it?" A pause of perhaps 4 seconds, long enough to be meaningful, short enough to be attributed to composure. "I did not need to read it, Mr. Holmes. I was familiar with its contents." She turned and moved back along the corridor before he could continue, her step unhurried and entirely controlled. Lestrade watched her go with the expression of a man who has just heard something he does not quite know what to do with. "Familiar with the contents of a 30-year-old court record," he murmured. "Now why would the wife of a solicitor be that?" Holmes said nothing, but I saw his eyes follow the line of the empty doorway with an expression of sharp, concentrated interest that I had learned, across many investigations, to regard as the first visible sign of a theory forming. We left the house shortly before noon. The November sky had lowered further, pressing the city into a flat, colourless light that flattened every shadow. In the street, Holmes walked for half a block in silence before he spoke. "3 things, Watson," said he. "The chemical treatment of the document requires both specialist knowledge and prepared materials. This was not improvised. The scrap in the grate was left by a person disturbed in their work or insufficiently attentive to its completion, neither of which suggests a calm and experienced hand. And Mrs. Penbury, who presents every external appearance of controlled grief, has not once asked us how her husband died." I considered this as we walked. "You think she already knows?" "I think," said Holmes, "that there are several things Mrs. Penbury knows that she has decided for the present to keep to herself. Whether she will continue to do so is the question upon which the remainder of this case depends. He flagged a passing cab with a sharp movement of his stick. "Baker Street," he called up to the driver. "I have some reading to do." Chapter 4. Words that Conceal. Holmes once remarked to me during a discussion of the methods by which falsehood is sustained, that the most dangerous lies are never those constructed from whole cloth, but those woven tightly around a thread of truth. A complete fabrication, he observed, carries within it the seeds of its own unravelling. There are too many unsupported surfaces, too many points at which the imagined account fails to connect with the material world. But a lie built upon genuine memory, genuine experience, genuine emotion, that is a structure with foundations, and it will resist examination with a tenacity that bald invention cannot approach. I recalled those words repeatedly over the 2 days that followed Penbury's death. As Holmes conducted his interviews with each of the dinner party's remaining members, he did not approach them as a group, nor did he invite them to Baker Street, where the atmosphere of our rooms might have conferred upon the proceedings an investigative gravity he wished for the moment to avoid. Instead, he called upon each individually, in their own surroundings, at hours he chose with care. I accompanied him on each occasion, notebook in hand, and it is from those notes, supplemented by my own recollections, that the following account is drawn. We began with Miss Eleanor Vance, whom we found in her lodgings in a respectable boarding house in Pimlico. The rooms were neat to the point of austerity, nothing displayed that was not functional, nothing retained that had outlived its usefulness. She received us in her small sitting room with the composed wariness of a woman who had been expecting this visit, and had spent intervening hours preparing for it. Holmes opened gently, with observations about the neighbourhood, and a question or two about the nature of her current employment. She was engaged as a reader and companion to an elderly widow in Kensington, before turning, with an ease that gave nothing of its purpose away, to the matter of 30 years past. "You appeared as a character witness at the Mallory trial," he said. "You spoke in his favour, I understand." "I did," she replied. Her hands rested in her lap without movement. "I had known Mr. Mallory slightly through the household where I was then employed. He seemed to me an honest and capable young man." "Ah, I said as much under oath." "You remember the case clearly, then?" "I remember what I said," she corrected with a precision that caught my attention immediately. "The details of the evidence were not mine to follow. I was a character witness only." Holmes then asked, with apparent idleness, whether she recalled the colour of the courtroom's panelling, the name of the judge's clerk, the weather on the day she had given her testimony. To each question she returned a prompt and specific answer. The panelling was dark oak. The clerk was a red-faced man with a stammer. The day had been wet, and she had ruined a good pair of boots in a puddle on the steps. Yet when Holmes inquired about the substance of the principal evidence against Mallory, the ledger, the disputed accounts, she became at once vague, careful, and general. She barely recalled it, she said. It had not been her concern. Holmes thanked her pleasantly and we departed. On the pavement outside he said nothing at all, but the slight elevation of one eyebrow communicated his opinion with perfect sufficiency. Colonel Armitage received us at his club in Pall Mall, in a leather-furnished room that smelled of old cigars and the comfortable certainty of a man who has never seriously doubted his own rectitude. He was in good humour, offered us brandy with the generosity of a host who wishes to establish the informality of an occasion, and spoke of Penbury's death with a sorrow that was genuine in its way, if not very deep. His account of his connection to the Mallory case was delivered with the fluency of something often rehearsed. He had been asked, as a man with some knowledge of commercial accounting, to review certain financial records at the request of Penbury's senior partner. He had done so, formed his opinion, and submitted it in writing. Beyond that, his involvement had been entirely peripheral. He could not speak to the specifics of the evidence, the conduct of the trial, or the character of Mallory himself, whom he did not believe he had ever met. "You had no personal acquaintance with Mallory?" Holmes asked. "None whatsoever." "Nor with the firm for which he worked?" A brief hesitation, half a second, perhaps less. I may have had some small commercial dealings with them. In those years I was engaged in various ventures. I cannot recall every particular. Holmes nodded as though this were entirely satisfactory, asked one or two questions of no apparent consequence, and rose to leave. At the door he paused, as if struck by an afterthought. "The financial records you reviewed, were they originals or copies?" Armitage frowned. "Copies, I should think. One rarely handles originals in that kind of preliminary review." "Quite so," said Holmes. "Good afternoon, Colonel." In the cab, I observed that the question about originals and copies had meant something to Holmes that it had not meant to me, and said so. "When a man is asked about documents he examined 30 years ago," Holmes replied, "he does not, as a rule, pause before answering whether they were originals or copies. That is not a question requiring thought. It is a question requiring decision." Dalloway proved the most demanding of the 3 interviews, not because he was evasive, on the contrary. He was almost aggressively forthcoming, but because his candour was of the variety that produces a great quantity of words without a proportionate quantity of meaning. He met us in his chambers at the Temple, surrounded by the ordered paraphernalia of a successful legal practice, and spoke at length. About Penbury, whom he mourned with warmth, about the Mallory case which he characterised as a straightforward affair made memorable only by its thoroughness, about the likelihood, which he pressed upon us with considerable energy, that some surviving associate of Mallory's criminal connections had returned to settle old grievances. This last point he developed with a facility that I thought remarkable. There had been rumours, he said, that Mallory had not acted alone, that there were others behind the fraud who had escaped prosecution. If one of these individuals had discovered the archive, altered the record to cast doubt upon the original verdict, and then silenced Penbury before he could bring the matter to official attention, well, that would account for everything very neatly, would it not? Holmes listened to this construction with every appearance of respectful attention, asked a small number of clarifying questions, and then, as we rose to leave, remarked with the casualness of a man making conversation. "You served as junior counsel during the trial itself, I believe." Dalloway's expression underwent a rapid and instructive sequence of adjustments. "Did I? Good Lord. Yes, I suppose I may have done. It was very early in my career. One handles so many minor briefs in those first years that they tend to blur together." He laughed with great conviction. I had entirely forgotten. On the street before the Temple, I turned to Holmes. He had not forgotten. "No," Holmes agreed, and he knew that I knew he had not forgotten. That is why the laugh was so very thorough. He walked on in silence for a moment. 3 interviews, Watson. 3 individuals, each of whom speaks about the periphery of the Mallory case with detailed fluency, and about its substance with studied vagueness. Miss Vance remembers the weather and the clerk's stammer, but not the evidence that convicted a man she thought innocent. Armitage recalls a peripheral consultancy, in terms so general they are effectively contentless. Dalloway has forgotten the role he played at the bar in a case he has just described as remarkable for its thoroughness. They are all concealing their central involvement, I said. More than that." Holmes paused at the embankment wall, looking out across the pewter surface of the Thames. "They are concealing it in the same direction. The vagueness is not random. It clusters around specific points. The ledger, the financial records, the substance of the evidence." He turned from the river. "Someone, Watson, has spent the last 30 years ensuring that 4 people remember a case in precisely the way that is least dangerous to all of them, and I begin to suspect that the alterations to that court record were not made by an enemy seeking to expose a conspiracy." He picked up his pace along the embankment. They were made by someone inside it. A red herring had been offered to us that afternoon, dressed in legal language and delivered with professional assurance. Holmes had noted it, turned it over, and set it quietly aside. We were, I understood as I fell into step beside him, no longer at the beginning of this inquiry. We were arriving at its true threshold. Chapter 5. The Case Reopened. There is a particular quality of silence that descends upon Baker Street in the small hours of a winter morning. Not the mere absence of noise, but something more positive, a density of quiet that seems to press itself against the windows from without, whilst the fire within burns down to a steady, meditative glow. I have sat through many such silences in the company of Sherlock Holmes, and I have learned to read their character. There is the silence of frustration, in which he is liable to reach for his violin or his pipe, or, in earlier and less regulated years, for other consolations I shall not enumerate. There is the silence of satisfaction, compact and still. And there is the silence of sustained and purposeful thought, which has a different quality altogether, a focused, almost audible concentration, as though the room itself were holding its breath. For the better part of 2 days following our interviews, Holmes occupied himself in that third variety of silence. He sent 3 telegrams and received 4. He made 1 visit, alone, to the offices of a legal gazette whose bound editions he had requested through channels I did not inquire about too closely. He spread across the dining table, much to Mrs. Hudson's suppressed indignation, a collection of documents that grew steadily in volume until they covered every available surface. And he moved among them with the quiet absorption of an archivist reconstructing something precious from its fragments. On the morning of the 3rd day, he looked up from the table as I entered, with the expression of a man who has reached a destination he suspected would prove uncomfortable. "Sit down, Watson," said he. "I want to take you through the Mallory case from its foundations. I have spent 2 days doing precisely that, and the picture that has emerged is instructive." I drew my chair to the edge of the table and he began, indicating documents as he spoke with a steady economical gesture. Edwin Mallory had been employed as a senior clerk by the firm of Cavendish and Prout, city merchants with substantial interests in the wool trade. In the autumn of 1861 he had been accused, initially by his employer and subsequently by formal prosecution, of falsifying the firm's ledger across a period of 18 months, diverting in aggregate a sum of some £400 into 2 accounts that could not be traced to any legitimate transaction. The case against him rested upon 3 principal elements: the testimony of an independent financial reviewer who had examined the ledger and found it tampered, the circumstantial evidence of Mallory's financial difficulties at the relevant period, and the sworn identification of the suspect accounts as bearing characteristics consistent with Mallory's hand. The financial reviewer, Holmes said, placing one finger upon a document, was Colonel James Armitage, then plain Mr. Armitage, at the early stages of a commercial career. He examined what he described under oath as copies of the ledger pages in question, certified by the firm's senior partner as accurate reproductions of the originals. "Copies?" I said, recalling Holmes's question in Armitage's club and the half-second of hesitation before his answer. "Copies," Holmes confirmed. "The originals were never produced in court. The reason given was that they were required for the ongoing administration of the firm's affairs, and could not be surrendered without commercial disruption. The judge accepted this explanation. It was not, in the legal climate of the time, an unusual arrangement." He moved his finger to a second document. The suspect accounts, those into which the diverted funds allegedly flowed, were identified as bearing handwriting consistent with Mallory's through the testimony of Armitage alone. No independent handwriting examiner was called. Dalloway, as junior counsel, did not object to this. Penbury, as prosecuting counsel, did not seek a second opinion. I felt the first cold movement of a realization forming, and the ledger itself, the original, has never, to my knowledge, been produced, examined, or accounted for from that day to this. Holmes laid down the document and straightened. Mallory's defence counsel, a capable enough man by his later reputation, was in the extraordinary position of attempting to rebut evidence he was not permitted to examine at source. He raised the point, it was noted and dismissed. The copies, the judge determined, were sufficient. Then the entire case rested upon Armitage's word regarding documents he alone had examined. Upon Armitage's word, Dalloway's professional silence, and one further element. Holmes reached across the table for a third document, a transcribed extract from the trial record, this one bearing the marks of recent handling. Miss Eleanor Vance. She appeared, as we know, as a character witness for the defence. Her testimony was brief and sympathetic, but it was preceded at an earlier hearing by a statement to the prosecution, a statement that does not appear in the version of the record we were originally shown by Penbury, but which I have recovered from a secondary archive. He held the page toward me. I read it twice. It was a deposition taken some weeks before the trial, in which Miss Vance stated that she had on one occasion observed Mallory examining documents at a desk in the household where she was then employed, documents she had assumed at the time to be his own private papers, but which she subsequently believed she said to be connected to his employment. The deposition was brief, carefully hedged, and amounted to very little as direct evidence. What mattered was what Holmes said next. That deposition was made during a period when Miss Vance was entirely dependent, financially and professionally, upon the patronage of a household connected to Armitage's circle. She subsequently appeared as a defence witness and offered testimony that effectively retracted its implications. The jury, who did not see the deposition, heard a young woman speak well of Mallory's character. What they did not hear was that she'd been placed in a position where her livelihood depended upon the goodwill of the man who provided the prosecution's central evidence. The fire had burned low without either of us attending to it. The room had grown cool. I set the deposition down with the careful deliberateness of a man handling something that has become unexpectedly significant. Mallory was convicted on the evidence of a man whose own financial dealings were never examined, I said slowly. Certified by copies no one else verified, supported by a witness whose independence was thoroughly compromised, and prosecuted by a junior counsel who had personal reasons to desire the outcome. And managed, Holmes said, by a solicitor who believed, I am prepared to concede this, Watson, in simple fairness to the dead, that he was pursuing a genuine case. Penbury was, I think, used. He was given evidence that appeared solid and never given cause to look beneath its surface. Until someone gave him cause. Holmes moved to the fireplace and added coal from the scuttle with a preoccupied efficiency. The critical inconsistency, Watson, is the ledger. £400 is not a negligible sum, but it is not a fortune. For Armitage, whose own management of the firm's finances I am increasingly convinced would not have survived independent scrutiny, it was sufficient motive to ensure that the ledger's full contents were never placed before the court. He straightened, dusting his hands. Mallory had discovered the discrepancy. He was not the man who had been stealing. He was the man who had found out who was. I sat with this for a long moment. Outside, a cart passed in Baker Street, its wheels loud on the wet cobbles, receding into the general indifference of the city. Then Mallory died in prison, I said, for a crime committed by the man who put him there. He died some years after his release, Holmes corrected quietly, in reduced circumstances and broken health, as Penbury told us, which is perhaps a distinction without a moral difference. He turned from the fireplace. There is one further element I have not yet placed to my satisfaction. The documents suggest that at the time of the original case, Mallory was engaged to be married. I looked up. Penbury mentioned no such detail. Penbury did not know everything, Holmes said, or chose not to disclose everything. The engagement was broken naturally upon his conviction. I have not yet established the name of the young woman with certainty, but I have a strong hypothesis, Watson, and if it proves correct, it will alter the entire complexion of this inquiry. He did not name her. He returned instead to the table and resumed his examination of the documents, with a renewed concentration that closed the conversation as effectively as a drawn curtain. I made a fresh notation in my book and sat quietly, listening to the fire and the distant, indifferent city, and waited for him to tell me what I had already begun, with a slow and reluctant certainty, to suspect. Chapter 6. Shadows of the Past. It has been my observation, over the long course of our association, that Holmes possesses an almost architectural relationship with information, and where others accumulate facts as a man might fill his pockets, indiscriminately with whatever the day provides, Holmes constructs. Each established fact is a load-bearing element, positioned with care, tested for weight, connected to its neighbours by visible lines of reasoning. When he invites me to witness the completion of one of these structures, it is rarely for the purpose of impressing me. It is, I have come to understand, because the act of articulation confirms the soundness of the construction. I serve on these occasions as the audience whose presence makes the lecture real. He asked me to accompany him on the following morning to the reading room of a legal archive near Chancery Lane, where he had arranged, through means he described only as having called in an obligation of some standing, my access to a collection of records pertaining to commercial proceedings of the 1860s. We spent the better part of 3 hours there. Holmes worked with focused efficiency, moving through ledgers, company filings, and correspondence registers with the systematic patience of a man following a thread he has already identified. I assisted where I could and observed where I could not, and by the time we emerged into the pale midday light of Chancery Lane, the picture he had been assembling in our rooms was considerably more complete. Armitage, it emerged, had at the period of the Mallory prosecution been engaged in a commercial arrangement with Cavendish and Prout that bore detailed examination. He had provided not merely the financial review that formed the backbone of the prosecution's evidence, but had, and in the 2 years preceding it, served as an informal financial advisor to the firm's senior partner. Funds moving through certain subsidiary accounts whose existence was, Holmes noted, recorded in the archive's company filings, but entirely absent from the trial record, connected Armitage to the firm in ways that were difficult to characterize as merely peripheral. He was not simply the man brought in to examine the ledger, Holmes said, as we walked eastward along Fleet Street. He was the man who'd been managing the arrangements that the ledger, had it been examined independently, would have exposed. Mallory, in the course of his regular duties as senior clerk, had access to those records. He had, I believe, and he had been preparing to raise the matter with the firm's directors when the accusation against him was made. Armitage moved first, I said, with considerable coordination. The accusation was lodged within a fortnight of Mallory's making certain internal inquiries that are recorded in the firm's correspondence files, which survive and which no one, apparently, has troubled to consult until this week. Holmes's tone carried no self-congratulation. It was the measured observation of a man noting what has been, until now, simply an unexamined fact. The timing is not coincidental. The question of Dalloway's involvement required less archival reconstruction and more biographical inference. His early career, Holmes had established from the Legal Gazette, he had been characterized by a number of notable successes in commercial fraud cases during the early 1860s, successes whose pattern, when arranged chronologically, suggested a junior barrister receiving well-prepared briefs with reliably favourable outcomes. His later career had been built upon the reputation those early years established. The Mallory prosecution had been among the first and most prominent. He was not the architect, Holmes said, but he was a willing builder. He knew the materials were unsound and chose not to examine them. A man of his intelligence and training does not fail to notice that the primary evidence rests entirely upon uncorroborated copies. He noticed and remained silent. That silence was not negligence, Watson. It was a professional choice with personal benefits. Miss Vance's situation was, of all of them, the most pitiable, and Holmes described it with a brevity that I think reflected a deliberate unwillingness to dwell upon it. She had been, at the time of the original proceedings, a young woman of 22 or 23, recently placed as governess in a household whose head was connected to Armitage's commercial circle. Her position, her references, her entire professional future depended upon the goodwill of that arrangement. When she had been approached to make the deposition, the preliminary statement whose implications she had subsequently retracted in her trial testimony, she had been offered, As Holmes had sourced from a surviving letter in the archive, a formal letter of recommendation, and a secured position in a distinguished household in exchange for her cooperation, the letter was signed by Armitage. She was coerced, I said flatly. With the particular efficacy of coercion that requires no threats, Holmes replied, merely the arrangement of circumstances such that the cooperative choice and the self-interested choice are identical. She was not a villain, Watson. She was a young woman with no resources, no family of consequence, and one professional asset, her reputation for reliability, which could be destroyed overnight. She made the choice that most people in her position would have made. He was quiet for a moment. The fact that she has lived with it for 30 years is, I suspect, not without its own consequence. We had by now reached the Strand, and Holmes slowed his pace as though the density of pedestrian traffic required it, though I suspected his actual reason was the weight of what remained to be said. There is one further connection, he said, which I confirmed this morning from the register of a parish church in Islington. In the spring of 1861, 6 months before Mallory's arrest, the banns of marriage were published between Edwin Mallory, clerk, and Lydia Harrow, spinster, of the same parish. I stopped walking. Around us the Strand continued its indifferent commerce, omnibuses and costermongers and clerks with umbrellas, the whole vast machinery of the city proceeding without the smallest acknowledgement that something had just fallen into place with the quiet finality of a key in a lock. Lydia Harrow, I said, Mrs. Lydia Penbury, who was at the time of Mallory's trial his fiancée. Holmes resumed walking, and I fell into step beside him by reflex. The engagement was broken at his conviction, understandably, and possibly under pressure from those whose interest lay in ensuring that no one with personal loyalty to Mallory remained positioned to investigate his case. She subsequently rebuilt her life. She married Penbury some years later. She became, by all accounts, an intelligent, capable, and thoroughly composed woman who gave no outward indication that she was carrying, through 3 decades of marriage, the knowledge that her former betrothed had been destroyed by the man she lived among. Did she always know? I asked. Or did she discover it recently? That, Holmes said, is the question upon which everything turns. If she has known for 30 years, her composure at the dinner party was a performance of extraordinary discipline. If she discovered it recently, within the last months perhaps from her husband's papers, then her behaviour since Penbury's death represents something else entirely. He paused at the edge of the pavement. Either she learned the truth long ago and spent 30 years waiting, or she learned it recently and acted immediately. Both possibilities have significant implications for this case. And Penbury himself? I asked. When did he know? Holmes was silent for a moment that stretched long enough to have its own character. I believe Penbury suspected the truth for some years and chose not to pursue it. Whether from professional self-protection or genuine uncertainty, or some more complicated arrangement of the two, I cannot yet determine with confidence. He raised his stick to flag a cab. What I can determine is this. The moment he retrieved that document from the archive, he made its suppression impossible and his own position untenable. Someone understood that, and someone acted upon that understanding before we could speak with him again. The cab drew up. Holmes gave Baker Street as our destination and settled back into the corner with the closed, focused expression that told me plainly enough that he had nothing further to say for the remainder of the journey. But I noticed that as we moved through the grey afternoon streets, his gaze, fixed on the middle distance beyond the cab window, had the quality not of a man surveying territory already mapped, but of one approaching a frontier at which the comfortable certainties of his method must give way to something more difficult, the knowledge that the truth, when fully assembled, would not leave everyone it touched unscathed. Chapter 7. The Convenient Culprit. Inspector Lestrade arrived at Baker Street on the Wednesday morning with the particular bearing of a man who has solved a problem and wishes the solution to be admired before it is scrutinised too closely. There was a brightness about him, a slight elevation of the chin, a briskness in the removal of his hat and coat. that I had learned to associate with those moments when official police work had produced a theory sufficiently tidy to be presented with confidence. Holmes, who had been reading at the breakfast table with the concentrated stillness of a man determined to finish a paragraph before admitting the world's existence, looked up with an expression of careful neutrality. "You have something to tell me," Holmes said. "And you would prefer, I think, to tell it in your own sequence rather than have me summarise it for you." Lestrade settled into the basket chair with a satisfaction he could not entirely suppress. "I have been making inquiries," he said, "of the kind that require rather more legwork than theoretical deduction, if you'll forgive my saying so." He produced his notebook, though he did not consult it, suggesting the notes were primarily theatrical. "There was a man observed near the High Court archive on the afternoon before Penbury retrieved the document in question. A stranger, not a clerk, not a regular visitor, but a man who spent upward of an hour in the public reading room without, as the attendant recalls, consulting anything in particular. He was described as thin, grey-haired, rather shabbily dressed, with a slight hesitation in his movement suggesting an old injury to the left leg." Holmes set down his book. "Observed by the attendant who is there every afternoon, and who, being a man of limited stimulation in his professional life, notices deviation from the ordinary with reliable accuracy. Continue." The man made no formal request for any document. He sat, he watched, and he left. Now, Penbury withdrew the record the following morning. 48 hours later, Penbury is dead, and the record is replaced. Lestrade allowed a brief pause for effect. "We have made inquiries among Mallory's known associates from the time of the original prosecution. Most are deceased. However, there was one, a younger man, a former lodger in the same house as Mallory during his employment at the firm, name of Crewe, Thomas Crewe, who has been living quietly in Bermondsey since his release from a subsequent, unrelated conviction some 8 years ago. He matches the attendant's description with sufficient closeness to warrant attention. Thin, grey-haired, an injury to the left leg sustained, we believe, during his imprisonment." "And Penbury's withdrawn funds?" Holmes asked. "Suggestive, certainly. A man in Crewe's circumstances, if he possessed damaging knowledge about the original prosecution, might well have begun by attempting blackmail before resorting to more direct measures. Penbury withdraws a substantial sum, perhaps as payment, perhaps as a first instalment. When Crewe's demands escalate beyond what Penbury is willing or able to meet, he silences him. The tampered record was Crewe's insurance, a document altered to expose the original conspiracy if anything happened to him, left in place of the original as a warning, or perhaps as a posthumous mechanism of justice. The theory was, I admitted silently, not without coherence. It assembled the available facts into a structure that bore scrutiny from a reasonable distance. The suspicious stranger at the archive, the blackmail withdrawal, the replaced document as insurance. Lestrade had constructed, with genuine industry, a narrative that accounted for the principal events in a manner that any magistrate might find persuasive. Dalloway arrived, uninvited, at Baker Street that afternoon. This was in itself an event worthy of note. A man of his professional standing does not call upon a consulting detective without calculation. And the calculation, I suspected immediately, had been prompted by Lestrade's developing theory. Whether Lestrade had shared it with him directly, or whether it had reached him through some lateral channel of the legal world, I could not determine. What was clear was that Dalloway had come to support it. He was, as ever, fluent and energetic, filling the room with his presence in the manner of a man accustomed to having his entrance register. He expressed, first, a renewed and considerable grief over Penbury's death. He expressed, second, grave concern for the proper resolution of the matter, which he trusted was proceeding through the appropriate official channels, and he expressed, third, with the elaborate casualness of a man producing his central point from a pocket, where it has been waiting since before he left home, a series of observations about the figure seen near the archive. It is known in certain legal circles, he said, with the measured gravity of a man sharing intelligence he has weighed carefully before disclosing, that Mallory maintained, even after his conviction, a small number of loyalists, individuals from his earlier life who believed in his innocence and, frankly, bore a grudge against those who had prosecuted the case. This fellow Crewe was one of them, by all accounts, a man with a history of petty criminality, a grievance 3 decades old, and the kind of fixed, low-level obsession that such men sometimes develop. He spread his hands in a gesture of judicial reasonableness. The matter seems to me, frankly, rather clear. Holmes had been sitting throughout this recitation in the attitude I privately associated with his most concentrated attention. Elbows on the chair arms, fingers loosely linked, eyes directed at the middle distance with an appearance of mild inattention that I knew from long experience was precisely the reverse of its impression. "I wonder," he said, when Dalloway had finished, "whether you could assist me with one small point. You mentioned that Crewe bore a grudge against those who had prosecuted the case. You were, of course, among that number, having served as junior counsel." "Peripherally," Dalloway said, with the immediate fluency of the word fully prepared. "And yet," Holmes continued without alteration of tone, "you appear to have no concern for your own safety in this narrative. If Crewe's grievance is as broad and as old as you suggest, one might expect his campaign of intimidation to have extended to others beside Penbury." A fractional pause. "Penbury was the most visible, the lead solicitor." "Just so. And Armitage, who provided the central evidence, has he reported any contact with this individual? Any letter, any approach, any awareness of being watched?" Dalloway shifted his weight fractionally in the chair. "I could not speak for Armitage." "No," Holmes agreed pleasantly, "nor could I as yet. Thank you, Mr. Dalloway. You have been most helpful." After he had gone, I turned to Holmes with the question that had been forming since Lestrade's morning visit. "Do you think Crewe exists?" "I am quite certain that Thomas Crewe exists," Holmes replied. "Whether he visited the archive, or whether he is connected to Penbury's death, and whether his introduction into this matter is organic or arranged, those are the questions that interest me." He rose and moved to the window, drawing back the net curtain to observe the street below. "The theory Lestrade has constructed is not without supporting evidence. A witness places a stranger at the archive. The withdrawn funds suggest a payment. The timing is superficially consistent. It is the kind of theory that satisfies because it requires no one currently present to be guilty of anything worse than allowing an injustice to stand." "Which is why Dalloway supports it with such enthusiasm," I said. "Precisely. A solution that redirects attention toward a dead man's former associate and away from a living barrister's professional conduct is a solution Dalloway would find, as he himself might put it, rather clear." Holmes released the curtain. "The difficulty is that the theory contains one element which I cannot reconcile with the remainder of the evidence, and that element invalidates the whole." "Which element?" Holmes turned from the window. The afternoon light was behind him, and his expression in that half-shadow was not the animated sharpness of a man enjoying a puzzle, but something quieter and rather more grave. "The document," he said. "The replacement record left on Penbury's desk. Lestrade's theory requires us to believe that Crewe, a man of limited means and no known legal training, prepared and substituted a chemically treated document of considerable technical sophistication, one that reproduced the format and seal of the original archive record with accuracy sufficient to pass initial examination. This is not the work of a bitter former lodger with a grievance and an injured leg." He paused. "This is the work of someone who has spent time understanding what the original document concealed and what, precisely, needed to be restored within it." He said nothing further on the matter that evening, and I did not press him. But I noted as I reviewed my notebook before retiring that the word he had used was not replaced or corrected or falsified. He had said restored. Chapter 8. The Test of Truth. Holmes has, on more than one occasion, expressed his admiration for the experimental method, not merely as the province of the chemist or the natural philosopher, but as a mode of inquiry applicable to human behaviour with equal rigour. A hypothesis regarding a compound may be tested in a flask. A hypothesis regarding a person may be tested with equal precision, provided one has the wit to design the experiment correctly and the patience to observe its results without interference. The difficulty with human subjects, as he once observed to me with the dry amusement that characterised his more philosophical moments, is that they are considerably more volatile than most chemical preparations, and their reactions rather harder to reproduce. The experiment he designed that Thursday morning was, in its essential simplicity, a piece of work I found almost elegant. He wrote 4 brief letters. Each was addressed to one of the remaining principals: Miss Vance, Colonel Armitage, Mr. Dalloway, and Mrs. Penbury, and each conveyed, with minor variations of phrasing appropriate to the recipient, a single piece of information: that in the course of his investigation, a second copy of the original Mallory Court record had come to light, held in a separate archive and apparently unaffected by the alterations made to the primary document. Each letter concluded with the observation that Holmes intended to examine the second copy with the assistance of a legal specialist, and would be grateful if the recipient could make themselves available for a brief subsequent conversation at their earliest convenience. No such second copy existed. I watched him seal the 4th envelope and set it with the others on the salver for Mrs. Hudson to dispatch, and permitted myself a single question. "You're concerned that the letters themselves may prompt some action you do not intend." He considered this with genuine seriousness. "It is a risk. I have worded each letter to suggest that the copy has already been located and secured, which limits the utility of any attempt to interfere with it. Whether that limitation will hold with all 4 recipients is a matter the next 24 hours will determine." He picked up his pipe from the mantelpiece. "We shall see what the flask produces." What the flask produced was, by any measure, instructive. Armitage was the first to respond, appearing at Baker Street the following morning without appointment, his florid complexion deeper than usual, and a quality about his movements, a slight excess of speed, ziths, a failure of the habitual ease, that communicated agitation more plainly than any words. He had come, he said, to inquire about the nature of this second document, to understand from what archive it had been retrieved, and to offer such assistance as his knowledge of the original proceedings might provide. His manner was that of a helpful man. His eyes, which moved once to the window and twice to the door during the course of our brief exchange, were the eyes of a man calculating exits. Holmes thanked him with warm courtesy, and told him nothing of substance, and Armitage departed with the dissatisfied energy of a man who has come for information and left with none. Miss Vance did not come in person. She sent instead a note, precisely phrased, which arrived at Baker Street by the afternoon post. She wrote that she was uncertain how she could be of assistance in the matter, as her connection to the original case had been limited and her recollection imperfect. She hoped that any document which clarified the facts of the matter would be given thorough and impartial examination. The note was signed in a hand that bore no trace of trembling, which itself, Holmes observed, was a form of evidence. Composure of that quality is not effortless, it is practised. "She's frightened," I said, reading it a second time, but she's also relieved." Holmes looked at me with the particular expression he reserved for those moments when I arrived at a useful observation. "Expand upon that." "She believes that a true copy of the original record, unaltered, would vindicate Mallory and expose the conspiracy. For Armitage and Dalloway, such a document is a danger. For Miss Vance, whose involvement was coerced and who did what she could to retract it in her trial testimony, it may represent something rather closer to absolution." "Very good, Watson. The relief is the more significant response. Armitage is alarmed. Vance is, as you say, relieved. Now, Dalloway." Dalloway responded to his letter with a visit to Baker Street that same afternoon, conducted with the assurance of a man who has had 24 hours to decide upon his approach and is satisfied with his preparation. He accepted a chair, declined tea, and informed Holmes with measured confidence that he had taken the precaution of consulting a colleague in the matter of archive records, and that he was advised such a second copy was highly unlikely to exist for cases of this vintage, given the record-keeping practices of the period. He then observed that he hoped Holmes was conducting his investigation within appropriate legal boundaries, and that he would be remiss as a man of the law not to mention that the use of fabricated claims to provoke reaction from individuals connected to a criminal investigation raised certain professional and potentially procedural concerns. He delivered this observation without emphasis, as a man who wishes it noted rather than acted upon, and watched Holmes's face as he said it. Holmes received it with complete composure. "Your concern is noted, Mr. Dalloway, and your colleague's expertise on archive record-keeping is no doubt considerable." He paused for exactly the duration required to be felt. "The document has, nonetheless, been located. Good afternoon." After he had gone, Holmes stood for a moment at the window with an expression that was not quite satisfaction, and not quite gravity, but occupied the territory between them. "He's not alarmed," he said. "He's warning. There is a distinction. A man who is alarmed acts from fear. A man who warns acts from confidence. Confidence that he has sufficient remaining influence to define the boundaries of this investigation." He turned from the window. "He believes himself at the worst embarrassed. He has not yet understood what I have understood." Mrs. Penbury's response arrived last in the early evening, and it was unlike the others in every particular. She came herself, unannounced, and sent no card up with Mrs. Hudson, but simply presented herself at our sitting-room door with the quiet authority of a woman who does not stand upon ceremony when ceremony would waste time. She was dressed, as she had been at the house, in black, and she carried herself with the same composed, watchful stillness that had distinguished her at the dinner party, a stillness that I understood rather better now than I had on that earlier occasion. She sat, accepted tea, and regarded Holmes across the rim of her cup with dark eyes that gave nothing away and missed nothing. "You have found a second document," she said. It was not a question. "I have sent that information to several people," Holmes replied, "and have been interested in how each received it." A brief silence. She set her cup down with care. "And how have I received it? Or, in your estimation?" "With a single question," Holmes said, "which you have not yet asked." She looked at him steadily. A moment passed. Then, "Does it include the affidavit?" The word occupied the room with a particular weight. Holmes's expression did not change, but I observed the quality of attention in his eyes shift, fractionally, to the heightened focus of a man who has just confirmed something he already knew. "Perhaps," he said, "you might tell me which affidavit you have in mind." She was silent for 2 seconds, the precise, deliberate silence of a person deciding. Then she said, with a composure so complete it had become its own kind of statement, "I think you already know which one, Mr. Holmes." Holmes set down his own cup. "Mrs. Penbury," he said quietly, "no affidavit appears in the official record of the Mallory prosecution, not in any version I've examined. The question you have just asked reveals knowledge of a document that, officially, does not exist." He paused. "I wonder if you would like to tell me where you encountered it." The silence that followed was of a different character from any that had preceded it in the course of this inquiry. It was not evasion, it was not calculation. It was the silence of a woman standing at a threshold she has been approaching, I now understood, for a very long time. Lestrade's convenient culprit had been quietly set aside, the flask had spoken, and the answer it had produced pointed, with the inevitable clarity of Holmes's best experiments, in one direction only. Chapter 9. The Weight of Memory. There is a moment in certain investigations, rarer than one might suppose and more demanding than they appear, when the work of deduction gives way to something else entirely. The evidence has been assembled, the hypothesis confirmed, the experiment concluded. What remains is not a problem to be solved, but a truth to be spoken aloud in the presence of those upon whom it will fall, with the full weight of its consequences. Holmes is not, as casual observers sometimes suppose, indifferent to this moment. He approaches it with a deliberateness that I have come to recognise as a form of respect, for the gravity of what is about to be said and for the people who will have to live inside it afterward. He requested through Lestrade that Miss Vance, Colonel Armitage and Mr. Dalloway present themselves at the Penbury townhouse on the Saturday morning at 11 o'clock. The pretext offered was a formal statement regarding the discovered document, required for the official record of the investigation. Lestrade, who had not yet been persuaded to abandon his theory entirely, but whose confidence in it had visibly diminished over the preceding days, complied with the blend of cooperative uncertainty that characterised his better moments. Mrs. Penbury had in the end spoken, not everything, and not at once. It came in stages, across the remainder of that Thursday evening, with the deliberate unhurrying of a woman who has carried something alone for a long time and is releasing it at a pace her own composure can sustain. Holmes listened without interruption, and I recorded as faithfully as the occasion permitted. What she told us that evening formed the keystone of the arch that Holmes had been constructing across 10 days of careful, patient work. She had found the affidavit among her husband's papers in the late summer of that year, tucked within the lining of a despatch box she had retrieved from storage following a domestic rearrangement. It was a document in Penbury's own hand, dated some 6 years after the Mallory trial, and it constituted a private record of his growing doubts about the prosecution he had conducted. He had, in those intervening years, come to suspect that the ledger copies provided by Armitage had not faithfully reproduced the originals. He had made private inquiries. He had found, through sources he did not name, that the accounts into which Mallory's supposed thefts had flowed bore characteristics more consistent with Armitage's commercial arrangements than with any scheme of Mallory's devising. He had committed these suspicions to paper in the formal, self-interrogating language of a legal mind that cannot quite decide whether it is confessing or merely noting. He had never acted upon them. He knew, she said, and the quietness of those 2 words carried a quality I found difficult to describe then and find equally difficult now. Not entirely, and not with the certainty that would have required him to act, but enough. He had enough, and he chose the life he'd built over the life he might have disrupted. She looked at her hands in her lap. I do not think he was a wicked man. I think he was a careful one, which in the end produced the same result for Edwin. Holmes, who had been still throughout this, spoke carefully. When you found the affidavit, you understood its significance immediately. I understood it immediately, she agreed. I had wondered about Edwin's conviction for 30 years. Not loudly, not productively, but I had wondered. She raised her eyes. I am not a sentimental woman, Mr. Holmes, and I will not pretend to you that I spent those 30 years in private mourning. I built a life. I did not spend it in ruins, but the question never entirely went away, and when I read Alistair's affidavit and understood what it meant, everything I had maintained for 3 decades rearranged itself rather abruptly. She had altered the court record herself. She told us this without evasion or self-pity, and in the tone of a woman acknowledging what is simply true. She had done it not to deceive, but to restore, to return to the document certain passages that she had identified, from her knowledge of the case and from the affidavit's account, as having been subtly misrepresented during the original alterations of 30 years before. She had the necessary knowledge. She had, through a combination of research and personal connection, acquired the necessary materials. The chemical treatment, the careful adjustment of text. These had taken her the better part of 4 months to accomplish. You did not go to the police, Holmes said. With what? Her voice remained even. An unsigned affidavit written by a man who chose silence. Documents that had already been manipulated once and whose provenance I could not establish to a legal standard. Against a colonel with a respectable reputation, a successful barrister, and a 30-year-old verdict. She shook her head, not in agitation but in the patient clarity of a person who has already rehearsed every alternative. I wanted the record to exist. I wanted the truth to be in the document, even if no one read it for another 30 years. I wanted Edwin to have been acquitted somewhere, in something that bore a seal. And your husband? Here she was quiet for a moment that cost her something. I confronted Alistair with the affidavit 3 weeks before he retrieved the document from the archive. He was distressed. He acknowledged the substance of what he had written, but he would not go further. He spoke of reputation, of age, of the impossibility of revisiting a concluded case without destroying everything and everyone connected to it. A pause. He was not wrong about the consequences. He was wrong about their relative importance. She had not, Holmes established carefully and with some delicacy, intended his death. She had placed the laudanum in the brandy decanter on the evening they had argued most acutely, intending it as a soporific, sufficient to produce deep sleep while she retrieved the affidavit from his study and removed certain other papers she feared he might use to discredit her account. The quantity she had miscalculated. She had not known, had not, I thought, in that moment of blind, exhausted urgency, allowed herself to know that the measure was mortal. Whether Holmes believed this entirely I could not with certainty determine. What I could determine was that he considered it carefully, measured it against everything else he had observed about this woman across 10 days, and found it not impossible. On the Saturday morning, the sitting room of the Penbury townhouse was occupied by 5 people, in addition to Holmes and myself. Lestrade by the window, with the wary expression of a man not entirely certain of what he's about to witness. Miss Vance and Colonel Armitage and Dalloway, arranged on chairs with the careful spacing of individuals who no longer wished to be associated with one another, and Mrs. Penbury, seated apart, perfectly composed. Holmes stood at the centre of the room and spoke for perhaps 20 minutes. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform. He presented the case, its construction, its evidence, its conclusion, though with the methodical clarity of a man for whom truth is its own sufficient justification and requires no theatrical assistance. Armitage's colour, as Holmes detailed the financial entanglement and the manipulated ledger copies, moved through several phases, settling finally on the grey of a man from whom something has been removed that cannot be replaced. Dalloway sat very still and said nothing, which was, for a man of his habitual fluency, its own form of confession. Miss Vance, when Holmes described the circumstances of her coercion with precision and without judgment, pressed her lips together and fixed her gaze at a point above the fireplace, with the expression of a person determined not to weep in company. The conspiracy that convicted Edwin Mallory, Holmes said toward his conclusion, was not the work of malice in its most obvious form. It was the work of self-interest, professional convenience, and the particular cowardice of those who understand that what they are doing is wrong and proceed regardless because the alternative is inconvenient. He paused. That it persisted for 30 years is not surprising. Such arrangements have great structural stability because every party to them has an equal investment in their maintenance. Mrs. Penbury throughout looked steadily at the floor. Holmes turned to Lestrade. Mrs. Penbury altered the court record and, by her own account, administered the laudanum that caused her husband's death. The precise degree of intent is a matter for the law to determine with more instruments than I possess. Armitage and Dalloway conspired 30 years ago to procure a wrongful conviction. Whether those acts remain actionable is similarly a legal question rather than an investigative one. He turned from the room. I have no further deductions to offer. The facts are as I have stated them. Into the silence that followed, Lestrade spoke with an uncharacteristic quietness that I thought rather well of him for. Mrs. Penbury, he said, I shall have to ask you to accompany me. She rose without haste, smoothed her skirts with the unhurried competence of long habit, and moved toward the door. At the threshold she paused and looked back, not at Armitage, not at Dalloway, but at the room itself, as though taking the measure of something she was leaving behind. Then she walked out, and we heard her steady footsteps on the stairs descending into the hall below. Chapter 10. The Final Account. The weeks that followed the resolution of the Penbury affair moved with the quiet, unhurried rhythm of London in late November. The days shortening, the fogs thickening along the river, the city pulling its collar up against the advance of winter, with the pragmatic unconcern of a place that has weathered everything and will weather this also. I returned to my practice. Holmes returned to his chemicals, his correspondence, and the sustained, eccentric industry that constituted his normal mode of existence between cases. Baker Street reasserted itself, as it always did, with the comfortable authority of an old habit. And yet the case stayed with me in a way that few others have, and I have examined that persistence with some care in the weeks and months since. Mrs. Penbury was committed for trial on a charge of manslaughter. The coroner, having accepted the medical evidence that the laudanum dose, whilst undeniably lethal in its effect, was consistent with a miscalculation rather than a deliberate and measured administration. I attended one day of the proceedings as an observer, and came away with the impression of a woman who had decided, as her final act of governance over a life that had required considerable governance, to conduct herself with absolute dignity, regardless of what was said or decided about her. She was acquitted of wilful murder. The manslaughter charge produced a period of imprisonment whose length I shall not specify here, as it is not my purpose to write a legal record but a human one. Her composure throughout, by all accounts, never faltered. Colonel Armitage and Mr. Dalloway faced a different reckoning. And one conducted less in the courtroom than in the columns of the legal and financial press, and in the quieter but equally consequential chambers of professional reputation. The revival of the Mallory case, which Holmes had ensured through carefully placed communications with a legal journalist of his acquaintance, would receive the public examination it had been denied for 3 decades, produced consequences that moved at the measured pace of institutional accountability, which is to say, slowly, imperfectly, and without the satisfying clarity of a verdict. Armitage resigned from his remaining commercial directorships. Dalloway withdrew from active practice on grounds of health, a formulation that deceived no one familiar with the circumstances. Whether either man was ever required to account for the substance of what they had done in 1861 is a matter I leave to the record, which is less conclusive than justice would prefer. Miss Vance retreated, as the outline of the events had suggested she might from public life, which, given the circumscribed nature of her public life, amounted to a change of employment and a change of address. Holmes made one quiet inquiry on her behalf, through channels I was not privy to, and told me only that she had secured a suitable position, and that no further difficulties were anticipated. I found, and find still, that I could not view her in the same moral register as the others. She had been used. She had done what she could, within the narrow limits available to her, to mitigate the use. The 30 years she had spent carrying the knowledge of it constituted, in my estimation, a considerable portion of whatever account might reasonably be presented. Of Edwin Mallory himself there was nothing to be done. He had died in 1874, 12 years after his release, in a lodging-house in Clerkenwell. He had no surviving family. The formal correction of the court record, which Holmes had insisted upon through his correspondence with the relevant archival authority, and which was eventually grudgingly accomplished, restored to his name the designation of a man wrongly convicted. Whether that restoration reached anywhere he could be said to inhabit is not a question to which I have a satisfactory answer, and I am not certain that satisfactory answers to such questions exist. It was on a grey December evening, thus some 3 weeks after the trial, that Holmes and I sat once more in our Baker Street rooms, the fire at its most generous, and the fog pressing softly against the windows, in the manner that always seemed to me particularly conducive to reflection. Holmes had been reading for the better part of an hour, and I had been making notes, not the careful, structured notes of an investigation in progress, but the looser, more ruminative kind that I produce when I am trying to understand something rather than record it. "You are wrestling with something, Watson," Holmes said, without looking up from his volume. "The morality of it," I said, "or rather the particular shape of it. Mrs. Penbury was guilty in the legal sense, and it seems to me not entirely guilty in any other. E. Armitage and Dalloway were guilty in every sense, and will escape with the mildest of practical consequences. That is frequently the case, Holmes replied, with the equanimity of a man who has long since made his peace with the imperfect relationship between justice and its administration. He set his book aside. The law is an instrument of considerable utility and limited scope. It prosecutes acts. It cannot, as a rule, prosecute the accumulated weight of 30 years of knowing silence, or the comfortable maintenance of an arrangement that destroyed a man in 1862 and inconvenienced no one thereafter. He looked at the fire. Mrs. Penbury understood that perfectly well, which is why she did not go to the police. She went to the archive instead. Do you think she intended his death? I asked. The question had been with me since that Thursday evening, and I had not put it to him directly until now. Holmes considered for a longer moment than was his custom before responding to questions of pure inference. I think, he said at last, that she did not allow herself to examine the answer to that question with her usual precision. There are moments in which people who are ordinarily very clear-sighted choose to be briefly myopic, and the consequences that follow from those moments are real, regardless of the clarity with which they were anticipated. He paused. Whether that constitutes intention is a philosophical question I am not certain the law has yet resolved to anyone's complete satisfaction, and I shall leave it there. I was quiet for a while. The fire settled with a soft collapse of coals. Outside, a cab moved through the fog with the muffled inevitability of a sound heard through water. She restored the document, I said. That is the word you used, not corrected or altered or falsified. Restored. You had understood the nature of what she had done before she told us. The chemical treatment was the clue that mattered most, Holmes replied. It was not the technique of a person seeking to deceive. It was the technique of a conservator, someone returning a damaged thing to a former state. Add to that her knowledge of the case's substance, her composure in circumstances that would have broken most people, her single question about the affidavit, and the conclusion was not difficult. He reached for his pipe. What was difficult was understanding what to do with it. This was, from Holmes, a candour of a kind he rarely offered, and I received it with the respect it deserved. He is not a sentimental man. He is not, in the conventional sense, a tender one. But he has, beneath the architecture of method and the armour of detachment, a set of moral convictions that are the more absolute for being so seldom displayed, and the Mallory case had brought him closer to their surface than most. Justice, he said presently, as though resuming a thought that had been running alongside his other observations for some time, is not the same thing as the law's outcome. A man may be acquitted and remain guilty in every material sense, and a woman may be convicted and have done the only thing that the actual facts of the world left available to her. He drew on his pipe and the smoke rose and dispersed in the warm air of the room. I said, in that house, that the law had merely caught up with time. I believed it when I said it. I am not entirely certain I believe it still. I noted this observation in my book, as I noted everything he said when it seemed to me worth the preservation. Whether this account will ever be published is a question I have not yet resolved. There are several parties still living whose interests complicate the decision, and I am not insensible to the difficulty. But I record it, as I have recorded everything, on the principle that the truth is better written down than trusted solely to memory, which is, as this entire affair has demonstrated, among the most fallible of our human instruments. Holmes was silent for some time after that, and I did not intrude upon the silence. The fog outside had thickened to the point where the gas lamps in Baker Street were reduced to dim, aureate smudges in the darkness, and the room had acquired the quality of a place set apart from the ordinary motion of the world, warm, contained, and temporary, as all such rooms ultimately are. The original form, Holmes said quietly to no one in particular, or perhaps to the fire, can always be discerned if one brings the proper light. He did not elaborate. He did not, I think, need to. I closed my notebook, set it on the side table, and we sat together in the comfortable silence of two men who have been through something, and arrived, if not at peace with it, at least at a steady and honest reckoning with its terms. Outside, London continued about its business in the fog, enormous and indifferent and entirely unaware that somewhere in its vast accumulated archive, the name of Edwin Mallory had been at last correctly recorded.